In the climate-controlled quiet beneath the British Museum, there is a fragment of clay no larger than a human hand. Catalog number K3454. A broken remnant from Assyria, 7th century BCE. Its surface is crowded with wedge-shaped impressions, cuneiform signs pressed into wet clay nearly 3,000 years ago, and then hardened by fire into permanence. It is a small thing, cool to the touch, dense, heavier than it seems it should be. Yet on that small surface, preserved by accident and patience and dust, there survives a story that should not exist in the form it does. Not as legend, exactly, not as poetry in the loose sense, not as the kind of tale that drifts and changes and brightens itself into symbol. The text describes an event, a breach, a crisis, a failure in cosmic administration. It tells of a being called Anzu, a divine creature, a guardian, a servant near the center of power, who stole something from Enlil, not gold, not land, not followers, not temples, not sacrifice. He stole an object. The text calls it the Tablet of Destinies. And the astonishing thing, the thing that sits at the center of everything that follows, is that the theft worked. That is the first fact that refuses to fade into ordinary mythology. The theft worked. The gods did not merely become angry, they became ineffective. They lost functional authority. They could no longer govern properly. They could no longer decree binding outcomes. They could no longer perform the duties attached to their stations because the power they exercised was not simply part of what they were. It was attached to something, contained in something, mediated by something, an object, a device, a token of office that could be taken. And once you allow that detail to remain exactly as the tablet presents it, a question begins to gather weight in the dark. If the gods needed an object in order to rule, then what exactly was ruling them? If the Anunnaki those beings later remembered as gods required instruments, procedures, permissions, assemblies, jurisdictions, if all of that was already there, then they were not the source of the system. They were operating inside it. This is not then a story about laws that gods gave to human beings. It is a story about laws the gods themselves had to follow. Laws that do not appear as moral sermons. Laws that do not arrive as vague cosmic principles. Laws that behave like procedures, protocols, administrative constraints, rules of authority, rules of transfer, rules of jurisdiction, rules of legitimate command. And that is why the surviving Mesopotamian tablets feel so strange when read slowly without hurrying them back into the safe category of myth. Across museums in London and Berlin, in Baghdad, in Istanbul, in Philadelphia, and Oxford, thousands of cuneiform tablets preserve accounts that speak with an unnerving consistency. Who could decide? Who could overrule? Which powers belong to an office and not a person? Which actions required assembly approval? What happened when procedure was violated? What happened when authority was seized without legitimacy? What happened when a deity crossed into a territory that was not theirs to govern? The fragment K3454 is only one piece of that archive, but it opens the door. In the Anzu narrative, the theft takes place at a precise location. Enlil is described in a specific moment of routine performing ablutions, setting aside the Tablet of Destinies. Anzu sees the opportunity. The text records his reasoning. With this object, he believes he can decree destinies himself. He can command the Anunnaki. He can occupy the center of governance. And again, the extraordinary thing is not that he desires the object. It is that possession of the object is enough to produce real consequences. The other gods do not laugh at him. They do not dismiss him as an upstart. They cannot simply declare his authority invalid and move on. Instead, they convene. They assemble. The crisis must be discussed because without the tablet, even the high gods cannot issue effective decrees. Their status remains. Their titles remain. But their command becomes for the moment symbolic rather than operative. Eventually, Ninurta agrees to recover the tablet. But even that solution is procedural. He does not charge off in a blaze of private heroism. He requires authorization. He requires counsel. He requires strategy from EA. He requires the proper weapons. And when the tablet is recovered, it is not kept by the victor. It returns to Enlil, because the power involved does not belong to the strongest hand. It belongs to the proper office. That same logic echoes elsewhere in the archive. Again and again, the Mesopotamian texts return to a term that scholars translate only imperfectly, pronounced may. The word is sometimes rendered as divine power, sometimes decree, sometimes office, sometimes ordinance. But the tablets themselves treat the me as things, not abstractions only. Things that can be counted, listed, transferred, guarded, stolen, delivered, located. In the text known as Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna visits Enki, keeper of the me in Eridu. There is a feast. There is drink. There is a sequence of transfers. Enki, intoxicated, offers her group after group of me, and the poem records them one by one with astonishing precision: kingship, priesthood, truth, judgment, sexual allure, craftsmanship, the arts of civilization, descent into the underworld. Each is discrete, each is named, each is acknowledged as transferred. And when Enki sobers and realizes what has happened, he attempts to recover them. Not because the gifts were emotionally regretted, not because his pride is wounded, but because the text implies that the issue is procedural. These powers are not personal trinkets. They belong to the order of things. Their distribution matters. Their location matters. Their guardianship matters. Yet once Inanna completes the transfer and presents the me in Uruk, the act stands. Whatever manipulation occurred at the beginning, the completed procedure has force. It binds even the god who tried to reverse it. And there, once again, we are far from loose mythology, and very near something else, a world in which correct form creates reality, in which an enacted transfer remains valid, because the system recognizes procedure, not sentiment. The same atmosphere hangs over the Atrahasis epic. The junior gods, the Agigi, are exhausted by labor. They dig canals. They maintain the earth. They carry the burden for 40 years. Then they rebel. But they do not rebel as chaos. They organize. They approach authority. They demand a hearing. Enlil does not crush them by fiat. He convenes the assembly. A problem is presented. A vote is taken. A solution is implemented by committee. Even the creation of humanity in that account is not spontaneous divine artistry. It is policy. It is labor redistribution. It is a regulated procedure requiring materials, ritual, specialized roles, and formal consent. And already the pattern is visible. The Anunnaki were powerful, Yes, but they were not free in the way later religious imagination often assumes gods must be free. They were bounded, they were situated, they exercised roles inside a structure they did not appear to have invented. So the first question remains, and it remains because the tablets themselves do not dissolve it, they preserve it. If the gods inherited offices, objects, jurisdictions, and procedures, if they ruled only by operating within a larger order, then where did that order come from? Who wrote the rules the gods were following? Who established the architecture in which even divine authority had to become lawful before it could become effective? That question is where the clay begins to deepen, and it is where we continue. The Sumerian and Akkadian texts are often translated as though their divine language were fluid, interchangeable, almost casual. But when you read them carefully, with the patience one normally gives to legal language, rather than to fable, a different pattern begins to emerge. The terminology is not casual. The distinctions are not decorative. The hierarchy is not vague. The word Dingir can mean God in the broadest sense any divine being. But within that broad category, the tablets distinguish between the Anunnaki, the Igigi, and in some contexts, the Anuna. These are not merely poetic variants. They are ranks, functions, roles. The archive preserves them too consistently for them to be accidental. The Igigi appear as laborers. They are divine, but they work. They dredge rivers. They dig canals. They carry out the physical burden of maintaining a world not yet handed over to human labor. In the Atrahasis narrative, they do not speak as equals to the senior gods. They petition. They protest. They present grievance upward. Their rebellion matters precisely because they do not possess final authority. They can refuse their assigned work, but they cannot simply redesign the system. That requires assembly action. The Anunnaki, by contrast, are repeatedly described as the gods who decree fates. But even that phrase, so often romanticized, must be slowed down. To decree fate is not to invent reality from nothing. It is to administer binding decisions within a recognized order. And not all Anunnaki are equal in that task. Some decisions require the full assembly. Some authorities belong only to certain positions. Some powers travel with offices rather than with personalities. Anu stands high in this structure. Heaven itself is attached to his authority. Yet even Anu does not appear in the tablets as a solitary autocrat whose will abolishes process. In the Enuma Elish, when the primordial crisis arises and Tiamat threatens the younger gods, the response is not a spontaneous command from the top. It is debate, deliberation, reluctance, negotiation. The issue is brought before the divine body. And then comes one of the most revealing moments in the entire Mesopotamian record. Marduk does not simply rush forward as champion. He makes terms. He offers to defeat Tiamat only if the assembly grants him supreme executive authority afterward. The request is stunningly political. He does not ask for glory. He does not ask for treasure. He asks for recognized jurisdiction, for enduring command, for constitutional change ratified by consent. The assembly does not hand this over casually. They test him. The text frames the test with ceremonial seriousness. A constellation, sometimes rendered as a garment, is placed before him. He is told to destroy it with his word and restore it with his word. He does so. Only then do the gods ratify the transfer. Only then is his authority formalized. This is not the atmosphere of arbitrary myth. It is the atmosphere of institutional procedure. Marduk does not seize power merely because he can. He negotiates for it. The gods do not submit merely because they are frightened. They confer authority through recognized form. And even then, Marduk's new status is not limitless. Other deities retain their domains. Ea remains associated with the Abzu. Ishtar remains attached to warfare and sexuality. Shamash continues to oversee justice. Supreme power here means coordination command, in crisis, binding executive priority. It does not mean annihilation of every other office. Again, the same shape returns. Distributed authority, separated functions, powers attached to positions. A system stronger than its current administrators. That becomes even clearer in texts about territorial order. In Enki and the World Order, Enki travels through the world assigning functions to lands, peoples, rivers, and deities. Sumer receives abundance and craft. Other regions receive the me appropriate to their nature. Rivers are given overseers. Mountains and seas are folded into administrative order. Yet the poem does not depict Enki as inventing reality by private whim. He is assigning, formalizing, implementing, executing a pattern already latent, already recognized. The assignments are binding, not because Enki personally prefers them, but because once established, they define jurisdiction. That is the key. Mesopotamian divine order is territorial as much as it is hierarchical. Different regions and realms have different laws. Different offices hold force in different domains. The gods are powerful within their assigned space, but not universally so. Nothing makes this clearer than Inanna's descent to the underworld. Inanna, who in the upper world possesses vast powers, approaches the realm of her sister, Ereshkigal. Yet, at each of the 7 gates, a gatekeeper strips away one of her divine powers. This is not depicted as humiliation for its own sake. It is protocol. She may not carry upper world authority unchanged into the jurisdiction of the dead. By the time she stands before the underworld judges, she is divested of what made her formidable above. There she is judged. There she dies. This matters. A major goddess enters foreign jurisdiction and finds that her normal authorities no longer apply. The underworld is not merely another place. It is another legal order. Another administrative domain. Another zone in which different protocols govern action, access, and consequence. And when rescue comes, it does not come as a dramatic cancellation of law. Enki does not storm the underworld and overrule it. He creates liminal beings capable of moving between categories. They negotiate. They satisfy conditions. Inanna's release requires substitution, equivalent exchange. The underworld's rules are not voided. They are worked through, satisfied by procedure. The same principle shadows the tablet of destinies itself. The object appears across multiple traditions, from the Anzu myth to the Enuma Elish. It confers the authority to issue binding decrees. But crucially, that authority is positional, not biological. Tiamat can give the tablet to Kingu. Enlil can lose it. Marduk can be confirmed in relation to it. The power resides in the office-token relationship, not in the unchangeable nature of the being holding it. When Anzu steals the tablet, cosmic order falters because the chain of authority has been displaced. But when Ninurta recovers it, he does not become supreme by conquest. He restores the object to its proper station. The office matters more than the victorious hand. What kind of divine imagination produces this again and again? Not one fascinated merely by miracles. Not one concerned only with praising power. Rather, one obsessed with legitimacy, with rightful possession, with transfer, with boundary, with the distinction between effective power and lawful power. That distinction matters because the tablets refuse to let it collapse. Anzu has effective power after the theft, but he does not have legitimate power. Marduk seeks legitimate power before battle, not after. Inanna acquires me through formal transfer and therefore keeps them. In the underworld, rank cannot erase jurisdiction. Office persists beyond holder. Rules persist beyond crisis. And so the central question returns in another shape. If no individual God is the source of all law, and if even the highest divine authorities act within a framework of assigned jurisdictions, tested transfers, and recognized assemblies, then the framework itself stands above them all. More ancient than any single reign. More durable than any divine personality. More fundamental than myth usually permits. The gods in these texts do not look like creators standing outside the system. They look like administrators standing inside it. And if that is true, then the system itself becomes the real mystery. In Chicago, in the collections of the Oriental Institute, there is an early dynastic tablet cataloged as a 7739. It is old even by Mesopotamian standards, and what it preserves is not a hymn, not a creation poem, not a royal boast. It is a list. That detail matters. A list is one of the least mythic forms imaginable. A list does not ask to enchant. It asks to record. It asks to enumerate. It asks to preserve order by naming things one after another, steadily, carefully, as though the act of placing them in sequence is itself a kind of control. And what this tablet lists are me. The entries are brief, some damaged, some still readable. Kingship, godship, the noble crown, the throne of rule, truth, judgment, descent into the underworld, return from the underworld, the scepter, standards, musical arts, priesthood, warfare, sexual allure, peace, strife, terror, kindness, trouble, triumph, weariness, decision, office, disorder, power. To a modern eye, the catalog can feel disordered, almost dreamlike. Why would a throne be placed alongside truth? Why would a weapon appear near a social office, or an emotional condition near a religious function? But perhaps the confusion lies with us, not with the tablet. Because, to the Sumerians, these were not random abstractions. They were components, distinct units of ordered reality. Elements that could be held assigned, transmitted, or withheld. The fullest narrative treatment of this system appears again in Inanna and Enki. It is worth staying with that poem longer than summaries usually do, because the pacing of the text itself reveals the logic beneath it. Inanna visits Eridu. Enki receives her. They drink from bronze vessels filled to the brim. The feast unfolds. And then, in a sequence of repeated transactions, Enki begins to hand over the me. The repetition matters. He offers. She accepts. The text confirms. Again and again. Not because the scribe was incapable of concision, but because each transfer must be registered. Each transaction must be marked. Each step must be recognized as complete. Enki speaks in the name of his power, in the name of his Abzu. Inanna takes what is offered. The language returns, loops, confirms, completes. And with every completed transfer, the shape of the story becomes stranger. These are not compliments, not blessings in a vague sense, not symbolic titles. Inanna loads the me onto her boat. She departs. Later, when Enki sobers and sends messengers and monsters to retrieve them, the action makes no sense unless the me are both tangible and operative. They are not metaphors being carried across water. They are effective realities being relocated. The text even stages repeated attempts to intercept the transfer. 6 times the pursuers overtake Inanna's boat. 6 times they demand the return of the me. 6 times her supporter drives them back. Why repeat the scene so many times? Because the poem wants to linger over threshold and completion. Until delivery is finalized, the transfer remains contestable. Once the me are presented in Uruk, however the process is complete, the system recognizes the new arrangement. Enki stops trying to reverse it. And so several features of the me come into focus. First, they are discrete. One can count them, list them, group them, transfer them in sets. The authority of kingship is not identical to the authority of priesthood. Sexual attraction is not identical to judgment. The underworld's descent and ascent are named separately. Civilization in this logic is modular. Second, they are portable. They can move from one center to another, from Eridu to Uruk, from one divine administrator to another, from one city's concentration of order to another city's flourishing. Third, they are regulated. Enki cannot simply pretend the transaction never happened. Once the formal process reaches completion, even he must accept the result. The system does not bend around his regret. Fourth, they empower possession. Uruk becomes culturally central, not because it wins a battle in this poem, but because it receives the me, authority, civilization, prestige, and functional capabilities shift through lawful transfer. If we stop there, the me already look less like poetic ideas and more like administrative permissions embedded in the fabric of the world. But the Akkadian tradition deepens this through the concept often translated as parsu, or divine ordinance. In ritual texts, correct performance of the ordained procedure does not merely invite a god. It compels manifestation. The distinction is subtle but enormous. To pray is one thing. To invoke through authorized procedure is another. Mesopotamian temple ritual often has the texture not of pleading, but of activation. Exact words, exact materials, exact gestures, exact sequence. If the ordinance is correctly executed, the result follows. The deity is not imagined as sovereignly choosing whether to participate. Rather, the god responds because the procedure has been properly enacted. That is a difficult idea for later theology, but it fits perfectly with everything the broader archive suggests. Divine beings are powerful, but their actions unfold within protocols. Human priests, by mastering those protocols, could access limited interfaces into that larger system. The rite was not symbolic theater. It was operational procedure. And once that possibility enters the frame, the ME begin to resemble something almost uncannily modern in structure. Not modern in content, not modern in language, but modern in logic. They function like permissions in a system, like modules in an architecture, like encoded ordinances by which reality's roles and capacities are instantiated and maintained. The Tablet of Destinies then appears not as an isolated marvel, but as the master access device within that same order. Whoever holds it can issue decrees that the cosmos recognizes as binding. Yet the Anzu myth reveals a vulnerability the system can be compromised if the access object is stolen. Why would such a vulnerability exist? Why would a cosmic order be built with a transferable point of authority unless the point of authority was intentionally bounded? That question matters because it bends the imagination in a very specific direction. A perfectly unbounded system of divine rule would not need constraints, but the Mesopotamian system is full of them. Domain limitations, procedural requirements, assembly confirmation, transfer rules, jurisdictional barriers, position-based powers, and a master token that grants extraordinary authority while still remaining external to the being who uses it. This is not the architecture of absolute divinity. It is the architecture of delegated governance, which means the old question returns again, but with more force than before. If the ME are not invented by the gods but administered by them, then the gods inherited a world whose deepest rules were already in place. Enki does not create the me. He keeps them, distributes them, loses them, tries to reclaim them. But nowhere does he author them into existence. The same is true elsewhere. The laws of the underworld are already there. The procedures of assembly are already there. The powers of kingship descend rather than originate. The fate-decreeing tablet exists prior to each new holder. The entire archive speaks as though reality arrived pre-structured. And so we are left with a strange image, slow and difficult and persistent. The Anunnaki had access, high access, significant access. They could move permissions ordinary beings could not touch. They could issue commands. They could alter conditions within their domains, but they did not write the underlying code. They administered an inheritance. And an inherited system, by definition, points backward to a source not yet named. Perhaps the clearest place to see the political character of Mesopotamian divine order is in the assembly itself. The texts do not present the highest gods as isolated monarchs issuing commands into emptiness. They present them gathering, arguing, voting, testing proposals, confirming transfers, managing crises through procedure. That rhythm appears so often and with such structural consistency that it is difficult to dismiss it as ornament. The assembly is not a decorative backdrop. It is the mechanism through which legitimacy is produced. In the Atrahasis epic, the cosmos begins in labor. The domains are divided. Anu takes heaven, Enlil takes earth, Enki takes the Abzu beneath. But the world is not self-maintaining. Rivers must be dredged, canals must be dug, foundations must be laid. These tasks fall to the Igigi, the younger gods, and the text emphasizes duration 40 years. 40 years of divine labor before revolt. The revolt again is striking in its form. The Igigi do not scatter into chaos. They do not simply sabotage reality and disappear. They organize collectively, burn their tools, march to Enlil's dwelling, and demand relief. This is not mindless upheaval. It is structured protest. It is grievance brought upward. And Enlil's response is not the response of an unchecked autocrat. He does not thunder them back into obedience. He convenes. He summons the senior gods. Anu descends. Enki rises. The complaint is heard. In the language of the text, the burden is acknowledged as excessive. The issue becomes a matter for collective decision. Then comes the proposal that will change everything, create humans to bear the labor. But even now, with the need urgent and the authority high, the solution does not proceed by individual command. It requires assent. It requires role allocation. It requires expertise. The birth goddess is summoned. She agrees only under conditions. Enki must provide the wisdom and the method. A god must be selected for sacrifice. Flesh and blood must be mixed with clay. Birth goddesses must shape the forms. Incantation must complete the process. Every stage reads like regulated implementation. Debate, decision, execution. And because it unfolds this way, the text keeps insisting on something that later religious imagination often resists. The gods are powerful, but not procedurally free. The same pattern appears in the crisis of Tiamat. In the Enuma Elish, the younger gods are threatened. Fear spreads. No one acts immediately. The situation must be brought before the divine body. Candidates for champion are considered. Others refuse. Marduk offers, but not without terms. His military service becomes the occasion for constitutional renegotiation. If he is to risk everything, the assembly must grant supreme command. Once again he is tested. Once again authority is conferred through formal recognition. Once again the narrative moves not by sheer force, but by deliberative procedure. That is why the Marduk episode matters so deeply. It shows that even at the brink of cosmic war, the assembly still functions. Crisis does not dissolve law. Crisis activates it. The body gathers. The question is put. Power is conferred. The decision becomes binding because it has passed through recognized channels. And after victory, the system continues. Marduk remains preeminent, yes, but the assembly does not vanish. The high gods still participate. They approve the founding of Babylon. They join in the work of construction. The executive office expands, but collective legitimacy remains in place. A similar texture surrounds the flood traditions, especially in Atrahasis. Humanity multiplies. Their noise disturbs Enlil. Measures are proposed. Plague first, then drought, then finally total destruction by flood. At each stage, the assembly consents. The decisions are formal, yet Enki dissents in spirit, even when he cannot overturn the vote. The fascinating thing is not merely that he disagrees, it is how he navigates that disagreement. When the final oath is sworn, and no god may warn humanity directly, Enki does not simply break the decree. He works around it. He speaks to a wall. He lets Atrahasis overhear. The letter is preserved while the intention is subverted. This is not rebellion in the raw sense. It is legal maneuver. It is procedural cunning. It is dissent expressed inside the system rather than outside it. And the system remarkably accommodates that. Once the flood has passed and the gods realize their choice has produced intolerable consequences, the assembly does not respond to Enki with annihilation. It debates, adjusts, revises. Humanity survives under new reproductive constraints. Law is modified through renewed settlement. What kind of divine order allows for that one in which the legitimacy of process matters more than the appearance of unanimity? One in which authority is collective, even when unequal. One in which technicality matters, because the framework itself matters. One in which the law does not vanish, because powerful beings dislike its outcome. The Anzu myth belongs here too. When the tablet of destinies is stolen, the first move is assembly. The gods gather because the collapse of executive function requires collective recognition. Volunteers are solicited. Gods refuse. Ninurta accepts. But even then, he does not act privately. He receives authorization. He receives counsel from Ea. He is instructed in proper method. The mission is institutional from beginning to end. That detail is easy to rush past, but it deserves to breathe. In these texts, heroism is rarely sufficient by itself. Authorization matters. Strategic knowledge matters. Office matters. Procedure matters. Even the recovery of supreme authority must itself be properly authorized. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the picture becomes difficult to ignore. The assembly of the Anunnaki functions less like a mythic chorus and more like an oligarchic constitutional body. Power is unevenly distributed, yes. Some gods carry higher office. Some command broader domains. But major changes to the order of things repeatedly require collective assent. And that means Mesopotamian divine society distinguishes between force and legitimacy with surprising clarity. Anzu has force after the theft, but he lacks rightful standing. The Igigi possess grievance, and therefore negotiation follows. Marduk seeks office before battle because victory without recognition would not be enough. Enki saves humanity through a procedural loophole because open defiance would violate the structure he still acknowledges. This is not a pantheon of whimsical superhumans doing whatever they please. It is a governing body operating inside a framework that limits action even at the highest levels. Which returns us to an even deeper strangeness. Constitutional orders require constituting principles. Assemblies do not appear in a vacuum. Procedures require precedent. Voting rules transfer rules, jurisdictional rules. These things imply prior architecture. Yet the texts rarely, if ever, narrate the creation of that architecture itself. They use it, assume it, preserve it, work within it, but they do not explain its first origin. The assembly behaves as though it inherited its own rules, and perhaps that is the most unsettling political detail in the archive. Not simply that the gods rule collectively, but that their collective rule is itself subordinate to forms older than any current holder of power, older than Marduk's rise, older than Enlil's crisis, older than the labor revolt, older than kingship's dissent. The gods govern, yes, but they govern constitutionally, and constitutions, whether written in clay or embedded in the structure of reality, always point beyond the current governors to something prior, something founding, something that the administrators did not themselves invent. There is a moment in the Epic of Gilgamesh when grief presses against the architecture of the cosmos. Enkidu is dead. Gilgamesh cannot accept it. He rages, wanders, demands, seeks crosses distances that should not be crossed. He wants an answer to mortality, but more than that, he wants an exception. He wants the rule suspended in his particular case. And what the larger Mesopotamian archive keeps telling him, in one form or another, is that death is not merely misfortune, it is jurisdiction. That word changes the texture of everything. Death is not simply something gods impose and might later revoke. Death belongs to a realm. The underworld is not a vague shadow place. It is governed territory. It has rulers, judges, thresholds, procedures, and boundaries that even the great gods do not casually trespass. The clearest procedural expression of this is still Inanna's dissent. Inanna approaches the underworld clothed in authority, crowned, adorned, equipped with the visible signs of divine office. At each gate, she is stopped. At each gate, something is removed. Crown, necklace, beads, breastplate, bracelet, measuring rod and line, robe. The sequence is exact, repetitive, almost liturgical. That repetition matters because the story is not hurrying towards symbolism. It is documenting process. At every threshold, the same logic is applied. What functions above does not automatically function below. What carries authority in one realm cannot simply be imported intact into another. By the time Inanna stands before Ereshkigal and the Anunna judges, she is no longer protected by the me she wielded in the upper world. Their eye of death falls on her. She dies. Her corpse is hung on a hook. The text does not soften this. A goddess dies because she has crossed into a jurisdiction where her own ordinary powers do not authorize her. That is one of the most radical legal implications in the whole archive. High status is not universal immunity. Rank does not erase boundary. Domain matters. When rescue becomes necessary, the same principle holds. Ninshuber goes first to Enlil. He refuses. Then to Nana. He refuses. Their reasoning is nearly formulaic. The powers of the underworld are powers that must not be violated. Finally to Enki, who devises a solution. But even his solution is not an override. He creates beings from beneath his fingernails, creatures neither fully alive nor fully dead, so they can move across the boundary in a way ordinary entities cannot. They negotiate from within the legal reality of the underworld. They do not abolish it, and even then, release requires substitution. Someone must remain if Inanna leaves. The law of the realm is not nullified. It is satisfied through equivalent exchange. Dumuzi's alternating fate later preserves the same logic. The underworld does not surrender its due. It accepts a structured compensation. So once again, the archive insists boundary is real, jurisdiction is real, law is not merely backed by divine anger, it is woven into the operation of the realms themselves. You see the same pattern in Enki and the world order. Enki assigns regions functions and corresponding me. But these are not random gifts. They must fit the nature of the land. A seafaring me belongs where trade and water meet. Agricultural abundance belongs where cultivation is possible. Purity trade craftsmanship fertility. Each domain receives what coheres with its character. This is not unrestricted creativity. It is lawful fittingness. Enki cannot assign just anything anywhere. Geography constrains authority. Nature constrains office. Regional qualities shape what can legitimately be administered there. Governance is not imposed from nowhere. It is aligned with the structure of the territory itself. And that alignment extends upward. Enki's power in the Abzu is immense. He shapes waters, fertility craft wisdom. Enlil commands winds and storms on the earth's surface. Anu governs heaven. But none of them in the texts operates as though every realm were equally theirs. The underworld remains stubbornly distinct. Human affairs require mediating offices. Celestial authority does not automatically cross into subterranean judgment. This is why the theft of the Tablet of Destinies becomes so destabilizing. The issue is not only who holds a powerful object, it is that the coordination point of lawful decrees has been displaced. The distributed system loses its center of authorized command. River seasons' weather cosmic function begin to falter because legitimate updates to the order cannot be properly issued. But even here, the texts are careful. The cosmos does not vanish. The system is disrupted, not annihilated. That detail is crucial. It implies a kind of resilience, a separation of functions, a structure capable of surviving temporary executive compromise long enough for restoration to occur. That is sophisticated architecture, not because the texts say so directly, but because they describe the consequences in a way that implies distributed robustness. A god within his own jurisdiction can appear nearly absolute. Enki in the Abzu, Enlil on earth, Anu in heaven. Yet that apparent absoluteness evaporates at the boundary. Enlil cannot simply overrule the underworld. Enki cannot command the stars as though they were his own domain. A goddess armed with upper world me cannot carry them unchanged through the 7 gates. And slowly, the same thought returns each time from a slightly different direction. This does not look like a world made safe for arbitrary divine whim. It looks like a world designed to prevent total concentration of power, distributed authority, territorial separation, procedural access, bounded competence, distinct legal orders, and mechanisms of passage that require special status transformation or compensation. Who designs a cosmos like that? The Mesopotamian texts do not answer directly, and that silence is part of the mystery. They preserve jurisdiction more vividly than origin. They tell us what happens if a boundary is crossed, what happens if a protocol is ignored, what happens if a power token is stolen. They show us the operation of the system under stress. They show us consequences with nearly case law consistency. But they do not pause to narrate the first drafting of the architecture itself. Instead, they write as though it were already old, already stable, already authoritative, already something even the gods must reckon with, not something they had recently invented. So Gilgamesh grieves, and beneath that grief lies an administrative truth more severe than comfort. Mortality is not merely tragic. It is assigned, structured, bound to a realm whose law cannot simply be appealed away. Inanna dies because she enters that realm without proper standing. Enki rescues only by procedural ingenuity. Dumuzi alternates because even compromise must satisfy jurisdiction. The same universe that permits extraordinary beings also limits them. The same cosmos that contains gods contains laws above gods. The same order that allows power also defines where power ends. And if the boundaries are this careful, this deeply built, this resistant, even to divine rank, then the architecture is not incidental. It is fundamental. Which means the question becomes harder to avoid. If the Anunnaki inherited jurisdictions they themselves could not dissolve, then the true sovereignty in these texts belongs not to any single deity, but to the lawful structure of reality itself. Creation in the Mesopotamian texts is never as casual as later retellings often make it sound. It is not a god waking one morning speaking a wish and bringing forth a species by private whim. It is slower than that, stranger than that, more procedural than that. The Atrahasis epic is again the clearest witness. Humanity is not created as a gesture of overflowing divine generosity, nor as an artistic flourish, nor as a purely moral project. Humanity is proposed as a solution to a labor crisis. That fact is unsettling enough on its own, but what matters even more is the manner in which the solution is implemented. First, the assembly must agree. Then the birth goddess must be enlisted. Then Enki's expertise must be applied. Then a god must be selected for sacrifice. Then flesh and blood must be mixed with clay. Then the birth goddesses must shape the forms. Then the incantations must be spoken. Then gestation must occur in due time. The text lingers over these elements because every stage matters. This is not improvisation. This is authorized procedure. Even the ingredients are specified, not merely earth, but earth joined to divine essence. Not merely animation, but animation through a sanctioned mixture that binds categories together. Why this complexity? Why all this formality, if the gods are absolute creators? The easiest answer, and perhaps the one the tablets quietly insist on, is that they are not absolute creators. They are operators within a framework that governs what kinds of new beings can come into existence, how existing categories may be crossed, and under what permissions life may be assembled. That helps explain something else in the archive. When transformation occurs, it almost always requires proper channels. Think of Enkidu in the Epic of Gilgamesh. Aruru forms him from clay, yes, but the being who results is not simply a settled human in the full civic sense. He is wild liminal, living among animals, drinking beside them, lacking language and cultured selfhood. It takes a second process to alter his condition. Sexual union with the temple woman transforms him. The animals flee. He becomes different. That sequence, too, has often been moralized or psychologized. But in the larger Mesopotamian framework, it reads as a transfer through a specific one of the powers associated with Inanna's domain. Sexuality here is not merely desire. It is civilizational interface, a protocol of transformation. Through lawful contact, Enkidu is brought across a boundary from one state of being toward another. The same logic appears in stories of divine and human parentage. Gods can produce offspring with humans, but the results are not simply full gods made mortal by accident. They are mixed beings, demigods, measured composites. Gilgamesh is called 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. The precision is so odd that it resists reduction to poetry. Why 2/3? Why not half? Why not wholly symbolic language? The archive gives the impression that mixture obeys ratios, that divine essence and human substance combine according to parameters, that being itself can be measured in relation to lawful composition. This matters when we look at the Sumerian king list and the transition around the flood. The earliest kings rule for impossible spans, tens of thousands of years. After the flood, lifespans contract sharply. Later, they contract again. Something changes, not gradually, but in abrupt thresholds. The texts frame these shifts as though the rules governing human kingship, human longevity, or human design had been altered. An atrahasis is explicit that after the flood, new limits are imposed. Barrenness, infant mortality, child-snatching demons, priestesses forbidden to bear children. These are not presented as emotional curses hurled in wrath. They are structured controls. Administrative adjustments to the reproductive system. Population management encoded into the conditions of human life. Once again, the same question returns. Why would divine beings need committee approval and procedural execution to modify human nature if they were unrestricted authors of it? Why not simply will the change? Why the vote, the decree, the implementation? Because the cosmos of these texts is regulated. Creation is allowed, but not arbitrary. Modification is possible, but not unbounded. New forms of being may emerge, but through proper channels and with appropriate authorizations. This becomes clearer in Enki and Ninmah. In that text, creation itself becomes almost experimental. Defective humans are shaped blind, weak, infertile, impaired, and Enki assigns them social roles. Then Enki creates a being so malformed that even Ninmah cannot place it. The tale is often read as comic or ideological, but viewed procedurally, it suggests something else. The system tolerates some variation, but there are limits. One can cross beyond proper parameters and produce forms that do not fit the order. The result is not necessarily instant destruction, rather censure, problem, friction. The created being resists integration. The social and cosmic order strain against the excess. In other words, the system has guardrails, and those guardrails too are revealing. They indicate that the ME are not merely powers for use. They are constraints on misuse. They define what counts as legitimate creation and what begins to trespass against the stability of the larger architecture. The pattern becomes almost impossible to ignore. No single God creates humanity alone. No transformation of category occurs without a medium. No reproductive or ontological shift escapes regulation. Mixed beings carry mixed outcomes. Post-flood humanity operates under revised parameters. Even disability narratives are framed through assignable roles and the problem of fit within structured order. All of this points to a universe in which the creation of life is not a private act of a sovereign deity, but a bureaucratically constrained operation. That phrase sounds cold, but the texts themselves are cold in precisely this way. They do not sentimentalize the process, they document it. Clay, blood, sacrifice, speech, timing, assembly limitation. The old assumption is that ancient people imagined gods as unlimited, but these tablets keep drawing a different picture. Their gods are immensely capable, yet procedurally bound. They can create, yes, but only in the way administrators modify a system that already has rules. They can introduce change, but only by invoking proper authorities inside a framework not of their own making. And if that is true, then creation itself becomes evidence not of divine omnipotence, but of divine subordination to a deeper constitutional order. A god may possess the role needed for one part of the operation. Another god may possess a necessary role for another. The assembly may supply legitimacy. A sacrificed divine being may supply animating essence. But the overall system decides what counts as valid creation. That is not freedom, it is access. So the central question returns yet again, this time from the domain of life itself. If the Anunnaki could not create freely, if they needed votes, materials, procedures, formulas, witnesses, and role coordination, then who imposed those restrictions? Who made a cosmos in which even gods require authorization to make new beings? The tablets do not tell us. They simply preserve the restrictions with extraordinary consistency. And in that silence, the architecture grows stranger. If the me were the operating permissions of civilization, then kingship was one of their most consequential deployments into the human realm. That claim is not metaphorical in the Mesopotamian archive. It is stated with directness that still startles. The Sumerian king list begins with a sentence that refuses every modern instinct to domesticate it. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not a king descended, not a dynasty arose. Kingship itself descended. The office, the institution, the authority. Something transferable intact, complete, moving from one realm into another. The Weld Blundell prism preserves this tradition with patient severity. Pre-flood kings rule for impossible lengths of time, 28,000 years, 36,000 years, reigns that stretch beyond biological plausibility. Then the flood. Then kingship descends again. But now the pattern shifts. Long reigns remain though shorter. Then still later, shorter again. The institution persists while the parameters around it change. Conventional scholarship often treats the numbers as exaggeration symbolism or dynastic shorthand. Perhaps. But the text itself does something more structurally interesting than mere exaggeration. It separates the office from the holder. Kingship exists before each individual king and survives after each individual king. It moves from city to city as though it were a packet of legitimacy being reassigned. That same logic appears in legal and royal inscriptions. The prologue to the Code of Ornamu does not say simply that the king rules because he is strong. It presents a chain of delegated authority. Anu and Enlil grant kingship to Nana, the patron deity of Ur. Nana then entrusts it to Ur-Nammu. The human king rules by mediated delegation. He is not the source of the office. He is its current operator. And because he is only the operator, he inherits obligations. Establish justice, prevent exploitation, maintain honest measures, restrain the strong, govern in alignment with the office's intended function. The office carries terms. It is not pure privilege. It is a contract embedded in cosmic order. This is why Mesopotamian political theology feels so modern in structure and so ancient in tone. The king is not merely divine, he is licensed. Empowered, yes, but conditionally. He stands between realms as interface, not as origin. He translates the higher order into local administration, ritual, infrastructure, law, and protection. If he fails, the consequences are not framed only as moral failure. They are administrative failure. The me of kingship can be withdrawn. The Curse of Agade preserves exactly this logic. Naram Sin violates sacred order by attacking Nippur, the city of Enlil. The response is not immediate lightning from heaven in the theatrical sense. Rather, the kingship authorization attached to Agade is revoked. Gutium invades. Irrigation systems collapse. Civilization frays. The city falls. The text presents this not as mere geopolitical misfortune, but as cosmic repossession. Agade loses not only military security, but legitimacy. The office that sustained its dominance has been taken elsewhere or dispersed. What failed first was not simply an army. What failed was authorized rule. This same model underlies the movement of kingship from city to city throughout the king list. Eridu, Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak. Then after the flood, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Ewan, Kish again. The institution remains singular while its local embodiment shifts. No city owns it permanently. No dynasty can cling to it forever. Holding kingship is always provisional. That provisional quality is essential. It means political legitimacy in Mesopotamian thought is neither purely hereditary nor purely personal. It is office-based and transferable. A ruler may inherit a throne, yes, but he does not create the me of kingship by inheritance alone. He receives an already existing authority through ritual divine endorsement and political recognition. This helps explain Gilgamesh in a deeper way. At the beginning of the epic, Gilgamesh possesses kingship, but uses it badly. He overworks the young men, violates social order, acts as though possession of office were permission for private appetite. The people cry out. The gods respond not by stripping him instantly of kingship, but by creating a counter-force. Enkidu arrives not to claim the throne, but to check the king, to correct him, to force the office holder toward a better relation to the office. After Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh's long search for immortality becomes something more than personal fear. It becomes the confrontation between office and limitation. He is powerful. He is partly divine. He is king. Yet mortality remains outside his jurisdiction. Siduri tells him what the larger archive says everywhere. In different forms, human death is part of the design. It was set aside at creation. It belongs to a boundary he cannot overrule. So, Gilgamesh returns to Uruk changed. He turns again to the walls, to the city, to what endures beyond one reign. This is not resignation only, it is education. Kingship is stewardship, not self-aggrandizement. One holds the office temporarily, one builds for successors, one maintains order so that when the office passes, the city remains. Here again, the same structure appears. The me of kingship is not personal property. It is positional authority delegated downward through a hierarchy, supreme divine order, city god, administration, human rulership. Every level is accountable upward. Every level is bounded. Compared with other ancient royal ideologies, this is striking. In Egypt, the king is divine in person. In many later traditions, kings rule by heavenly mandate, but often with a heavy emphasis on sacral singularity. Mesopotamia is different. The king remains subordinate not merely to the gods in general, but to a specific legal administrative framework those gods themselves do not seem to have originated. That is why the phrase kingship, descended from heaven, carries so much weight. It implies that kingship existed before humanity as an office in the larger cosmic order. Only later was it extended downward. Human government, then, is not an invention from below projected upward. It is an implementation from above projected downward. And yet, even the Anunnaki in the texts do not appear to invent kingship itself. They decide when and where to deploy it, yes. They administer it, delegate it, reassign it. But the institution seems older than its application to humans. It is one more component of the system they are using, rather than one they authored from scratch. So, the pattern repeats: office before holder, legitimacy before force transfer, before possession, administration before invention. And the question beneath all of it remains suspended. If kingship was a me that could descend from heaven, where was it before it descended? Who held it? Who encoded it into the larger order? Who decided that this particular form of structured authority would one day be extended to human cities? The tablets preserve the application. They preserve the transfers. They preserve the failures. They preserve the consequences of illegitimate rule. But they do not take us all the way back to the origin. They give us the operating history, not the first design document. The laws that bind gods become clearest when gods try to violate them. That may be why the fragmentary tablet K3454 matters so much. The Anzu myth is not merely a dramatic tale about a thief in the divine court. It is a case study in rebellion against lawful authority and in the system's response to that rebellion. Anzu is not introduced as a primordial enemy. He is a trusted guardian near Enlil's chamber. He has access. He is close to the center. He understands the structure well enough to know where authority resides and how it can be seized. That detail matters. His rebellion is not blind rage. It is informed ambition. The text preserves his reasoning with unsettling clarity. He will take the tablet of destinies. He will control the decrees of the gods. He will establish his throne. He will direct the assignments of the divine labor force. In other words, he knows exactly how governance works. He knows that effective sovereignty in this system depends on the proper access device. And again, the theft works. This cannot be overstated. It works. The other gods become unable to perform their offices properly. Divine decrees are suspended. Stillness spreads. The machinery of governance falters. Why? Because the system recognizes possession of the tablet as the operative condition for binding command. Worthiness is not enough. Title is not enough. Proximity to former power is not enough. Proper access is required. That is both the strength and the vulnerability of the system. It is lawful, but because it is lawful, it can be compromised through the wrongful seizure of lawful instruments. The assembly gathers. Volunteers are sought. Gods decline. Not out of simple fear, but because they understand the practical situation. Anzu now holds the mechanism of legitimate command. To confront him without strategy would be futile. One could be neutralized by the very power one seeks to undo. Then Ninurta accepts the mission. But even here, the narrative resists the romantic shortcut. He does not simply attack. EA provides the plan. Wait for the moment when Anzu opens his mouth to decree. In the act of vocalizing lawful command, he becomes vulnerable. Strike then. Use the right weapon. Interrupt the issuance before it completes. The detail is extraordinary. Supreme authority itself contains procedural exposure. Decrees must be spoken. Spoken decrees create a moment of risk. The system then does not permit silent, unobservable absolutism. Even its highest executable command requires manifestation, expression, an opening in which intervention becomes possible. Ninurta succeeds, but the restoration is as important as the recovery. He does not keep the tablet. He returns it to Enlil. The assembly confirms the rightful order. Heroic action restores legitimacy. It does not replace legitimacy. The strongest being on the field does not automatically become sovereign. This same distinction between raw power and rightful possession appears again in the Enuma Elish, where Tiamat gives the Tablet of Destinies to Kingu. The transfer is formalized. Once it occurs, Kingu becomes a real threat because he now holds an office token that grants functional command. Yet after Marduk defeats him, confirmation is still required. Possession reclaimed must be reintegrated into lawful hierarchy. Recovery alone is not enough. Restoration requires recognition. The pattern grows clearer when placed beside other forms of rebellion. The labor revolt of the Agigi and Atrahasis is also rebellion, but a different kind. They refuse assigned work. They organize. They surround Enlil's dwelling. Yet the response is negotiation, not annihilation. Why? Because their grievance is structurally valid. They are not trying to seize the center. They are challenging an intolerable workload within the system. So, the system adapts. Anzu, by contrast, attempts to capture supreme executive authority. That kind of rebellion produces immediate cosmic crisis because it attacks the chain of legitimate command itself. The distinction is subtle but profound. Mesopotamian divine law does not treat all dissent alike. Grievance may be heard, procedure may accommodate complaint. But seizure of central authority without proper transfer is another matter. That is illegitimate usurpation. And then there is Inanna's acquisition of the Emi from Enki. At first glance, this too looks like divine theft. Enki is intoxicated. Inanna departs quickly. Pursuit follows. Yet when the transfer reaches formal completion in Uruk, it stands. No punishment descends. No assembly reverses it. Why? Because form matters more than private motive. Enki offered. Inanna accepted. The Emi were moved. They were publicly presented. Procedure, however manipulated, was completed. This is legalism in the strict sense. The system evaluates not by inward morality, but by recognized process. That may feel alien to later moral frameworks, but it is entirely consistent across the archive. Proper form confers validity. Improper seizure confers only temporary force. Jurisdiction violated triggers automatic consequence. Office misused invites withdrawal. We see this again in human cases. Naram-Sin attacks Nippur. The result is not framed as divine offended feeling alone. It is framed as violation of sacred jurisdiction. The office attached to his kingship is effectively revoked. The city falls. Inanna enters the underworld without authority adequate to that realm and is judged according to its laws, despite her rank above. Again and again, the same principle presses through the order, is procedural rather than sentimental. And because it is procedural, it behaves almost mechanically. Trespass yields consequence. Improper transfer yields crisis. Proper completion yields binding effect. This helps explain why the texts so rarely speak of divine forgiveness in the later religious sense. The issue is less pardon than protocol. A violation may be mitigated by workaround negotiation, substitution, or restoration. But the underlying law does not simply evaporate because a powerful being wishes it gone. Which leads to another difficult thought. If the consequences of violation emerge automatically from the structure of reality itself, then where is enforcement located? Not in a police force, not in a supreme visible judge hovering above all the gods. Rather, the enforcement seems built into the design. The system answers trespass with consequence because that is how it is made. That is governance by architecture rather than by whim. And if governance is architectural, the gods are not the architects. They are users, exalted users, dangerous users, highly placed users, but still users. So, when Anzu seizes the tablet, the system does not cease to exist. It identifies the stolen credential. It responds according to the powers attached to it. When Ninurta restores the tablet, the order stabilizes because the credential is returned to rightful office. The process feels less like epic fantasy than like a crisis in institutional continuity. The more slowly one reads these stories, the less they sound like allegories about pride, and the more they sound like preserved records of how legitimacy behaves under pressure. And under that pressure, the same truth keeps returning. The gods could rebel. The gods could scheme. The gods could exploit procedure. The gods could even briefly seize effective control. But they could not abolish the lawful architecture within which those acts took place. Few stories reveal the procedural soul of Mesopotamian divine governance more starkly than the flood in Atrahasis. Later traditions often moralize floods. They become punishment for sin corruption, violence, impurity. But the older Mesopotamian version is colder, stranger, and in some ways far more revealing. The problem is noise. Humanity multiplies. Cities grow. Their clamor rises. Enlil cannot rest. The issue is practical, not moral. Administration is being disrupted by the side effects of the system's own success. Humanity, once created as labor relief, has become too populous. The gods must decide what to do. And again, it is not one god simply deciding alone. Measures are brought forward sequentially. First plague, then drought. Then, when these fail to secure a lasting quiet, the flood. At each stage, the assembly assents. The process is repeated. Proposal, consent, implementation. Result. Enki's role in this sequence is as revealing as Enlil's. He does not openly overthrow the decisions. He works around them. When plague is sent, he instructs humans through Atrahasis how to appease the relevant force. When drought comes, he finds another way to relieve its effects. Each time, the assembly's action is not reversed in public form, but its intent is softened or undermined through procedural intelligence. Finally, Enlil demands something irreversible: a flood, not temporary discipline, not scarcity, not pestilence, total destruction of terrestrial life. And this time, he binds the assembly by oath. No god is to warn humanity. No god is to interfere. The decision is formalized with extraordinary seriousness because its scale is final. But even here, the text leaves room for dissent. It does not present the vote as a pure chorus of unanimity. Enki's later behavior makes that plain enough. He is bound by oath, yes. But boundness does not equal inward agreement. So he turns to the loophole. He cannot speak directly to Atrahasis. Therefore, he speaks to the reed wall of Atrahasis's house. The wall hears. Atrahasis on the other side also hears. Instructions are given. Tear down the house, build the boat, bring aboard the seed of life. Take craftsmen, family animals, provisions. The dimensions matter. The materials matter. The timing matters. The rescue, like everything else in these texts, is procedural. Then the flood comes. The description is severe: darkness, storm, waters swallowing settlements, 7 days and 7 nights of destruction. Human life outside the vessel is erased. The old world disappears beneath water. The assembly's decision has been executed. And then something unexpected happens, or perhaps something the assembly failed to calculate. The gods regret it. Ishtar cries out in anguish. The gods weep. Humanity, whom they had destroyed for practical reasons, was also their sustaining labor force. Without humans, there are no temples maintained, no offerings prepared, no sacrifices rising. The gods become hungry. When Atrahasis emerges and offers sacrifice, the gods gather like flies around the offering. It is one of the most undignified images in all divine literature, and it may also be one of the most important, because it proves their fallibility. The assembly made a decision. The decision had consequences. The consequences were not fully foreseen. The gods suffer from their own policy. They are not omniscient enough to legislate without error. They are bound not only by law, but by outcome. Enlil, discovering that humans survived, is furious. A decree was made. An oath was sworn. How has its intention been escaped? Enki's defense is precise. He did not directly reveal the secret. He did not openly violate the oath. Atrahasis learned through a mediated route. The law's letter was preserved while its intention was defeated. Again, this is not random mythic trickery. It is jurisprudence. It is argument about compliance technicality, intent, and formal obligation. Enki is effectively saying, I remained within the structure while preserving what I believed the structure itself ultimately required. And the remarkable thing is that the defense works. The assembly does not tear itself apart. It adapts. A new settlement is negotiated. Humanity remains, but under altered conditions. Reproductive restrictions are introduced. The problem of overpopulation is addressed not by total eradication, but by built-in limits. That outcome tells us almost everything about the Mesopotamian understanding of law at the divine level. First major actions require assembly legitimacy. Second, dissent can persist even after formal decision. Third oath is binding even on gods. Fourth, loopholes are meaningful because the system is procedural. Fifth, consequences exist independently of divine desire. Sixth, mistaken policy can be revised, but only through new formal adjustment. This is not arbitrary divine behavior. It is institutional process under cosmic stakes. And it is worth lingering on the problem of consequence, because it may be the deepest clue of all. The assembly could vote to destroy humanity, but it could not vote away the consequences of destroying humanity. Once the human labor sacrifice economy was interrupted, hunger followed, dependency followed, structural imbalance followed. The gods discovered that their authority did not include exemption from the system's causal logic. That point cannot be overstated. They could decide within the system. They could not abolish the system's own response to what they had decided. This is the same principle seen elsewhere under different conditions. The underworld demands substitution. Stolen authority destabilizes governance. Misused kingship gets revoked. Boundary violation yields consequence. The flood story simply magnifies the pattern to the largest scale imaginable. And because it does, it turns the assembly itself into something more than a council of powerful beings. It becomes a site where fallible administrators make decisions inside a lawful reality they do not fully master. Sometimes they legislate wisely. Sometimes they legislate badly. Sometimes one of them preserves the future through procedural cleverness. But none of them escapes the fact that the system remains larger than the chooser. That is why the flood story lingers in the mind after the waters recede, not merely because the destruction is vast, but because the legal and political texture remains intact throughout. Proposal, assent, oath, workaround, consequence, defense, renegotiation, revised human design. Everything is procedural. Even apocalypse is procedural. And if apocalypse itself must pass through lawful channels, then law in this archive is not decorative theology. It is the grammar of reality. The gods speak it, sometimes skillfully, sometimes recklessly, sometimes against one another, but always inside it. Which means the oldest and quietest question still remains beneath the thunder of the flood. If the Anunnaki could authorize destruction, but not escape its consequences, if they could legislate, but not abolish causal structure, if they could swear oaths that bound even themselves, then who or what established the order within which divine decisions become real, but never unlimited? The tablets do not tell us. They only preserve the minutes of the vote. By now, the pattern is difficult to miss, and perhaps difficult to unsee. The tablets sit in museum vaults, in digitized archives, in university databases, freely accessible to anyone patient enough to read them. They are not hidden in the dramatic sense. They are cataloged, translated, footnoted, scanned. And yet they remain invisible because most people approach them through a frame that decides in advance what they are allowed to mean. We are told they are myths, primitive cosmologies, anthropological curiosities, early attempts to explain weather, kingship, death, fertility, flood, and fear. Once that frame is fixed, all procedural detail becomes decorative. Assemblies become symbolic. Transfers become metaphors. Jurisdictions become narrative color. The astonishing legal precision of the archive gets flattened into religious imagination. But if that interpretive frame is suspended, not rejected with certainty, merely suspended, then the tablets begin to look different. They begin to read not like free-floating myths, but like records written by people who believed they were preserving operational truth. Not necessarily truth in the modern archival sense, not necessarily newspaper history, but accurate process, reliable pattern, repeatable structure. Read that way, the Anunnaki are no longer primarily creators. They are governors, administrators, holders of office, users of inherited authority, managers of domains, coordinators of labor, allocators of power, enforcers and subjects of protocol alike. That interpretation suddenly explains details that otherwise seem oddly misplaced in divine literature. Why such concern with who may call an assembly? Why such care about whether consent is unanimous or majoritarian? Why the fixation on transfer authorization, territorial competence, proper speech, public presentation, oath, and substitution? Why the repeated distinction between effective force and legitimate authority? It explains these things because those are the concerns of governance. Not governance in the narrow modern sense only, but governance at the scale of reality itself. The management of conditions, boundaries, office, resource flow, labor burden, human population, access to binding decree, maintenance of the world. That does not prove the texts are describing literal extraterrestrial beings or hidden technologies or any of the familiar, sensational substitutes people rush toward when they feel the ground move beneath conventional interpretation. The tablets do not say those things. They do not need those things. Their strangeness is already sufficient without importing new stories. What they do say with remarkable consistency is that the beings called gods were constrained. They could eat sleep desire, fear, argue, make mistakes, suffer consequences, and die in some qualified sense. They occupied positions inside a lawful order. They inherited a set of powers and restrictions. They administered something larger than themselves. That larger thing, the ME system, the distributed jurisdictions, the assembly procedures, the office tokens, the lawful transfers, that larger thing may be the real subject of the entire archive. And if it is, then the silence around its origin becomes the loudest silence in the collection. Imagine the Sumerian scribe, trained for years, copying ancient material under lamplight, preserving the stories of Enki, Inanna, Enlil, Anu, Ninurta, Marduk, preserving flood decisions, labor crises, thefts of authority, transfers of kingship. If that scribe believed these were merely imaginative stories, one might expect origin tales to proliferate wherever gaps appeared. One might expect bold invention at the edges. But instead, the texts often stop at the threshold. The me are already there. The tablet of destinies already exists. Assembly procedures are already recognized. Jurisdictional boundaries are already in force. Kingship descends from heaven as though it had long existed there before arriving here. The system is inherited, not freshly imagined. That restraint matters. It suggests the scribes knew the limits of what they were preserving. They were copying operational accounts, not design specifications. They knew how the system worked, at least as transmitted to them. They did not claim to know where the system ultimately came from. And that difference between operational knowledge and origin knowledge is one we recognize even now. A person may know how to run a machine without knowing how to design it. A government official may know how to administer law without knowing the deepest philosophical origin of law itself. A user may know a system intimately and still remain ignorant of its first construction. The Anunnaki in these texts often feel like such users. High-level users, powerful administrators, experts in procedure, but not authors of the architecture. The archive even preserves the layered hierarchy this implies. Human kings rule under city gods. City gods operate within the assembly of the greater deities. The assembly itself functions within the me system, and the me system is never fully grounded in an origin story. The latter rises and then vanishes into mist. That vanishing point may be the most unsettling detail of all, because it leaves us with two possibilities, neither comfortable. The first is that the Sumerians were astonishing political theorists far in advance of later civilizations and projected constitutional, procedural, and jurisdictional logic into their divine texts with unmatched sophistication. If so, then we must ask why so much of that sophistication was later obscured, why subsequent traditions often preferred divine absolutism, sacred monarchy, or moralized myth over this intricate picture of bounded power. The second possibility is that the Sumerians were preserving observations, however transformed by language and culture, about a reality they believed they had encountered. not gods as pure invention, but governors, administrators, powers within powers, all operating under a lawful order older than themselves. Neither option allows easy comfort. If they invented this, they invented with startling clarity. If they observed it, then what they observed was unlike the simple mythological imagination we often attribute to the ancient world. And perhaps this is why the tablets continue to feel so dry in their strangeness. There are battles, yes, but often the battles are about office. There are deaths, but often death is jurisdiction. There are gifts, but often gifts are regulated transfers of operative power. There are floods, but often flood is assembly policy gone wrong. Again and again, the emotional force of myth is edged by the formal logic of administration. Meetings, votes, assignments, appeals, technicalities, boundary disputes, office changes, revisions after failed policy. If this is mythology, it is mythology with the soul of a legal archive. And if it is documentation, then it is documentation of a universe in which reality itself is governed constitutionally. That phrase may sound too modern, but perhaps what feels modern is not the archive. Perhaps what feels modern is simply any system in which power is bounded by procedure and legitimacy matters more than force. Perhaps we call it modern only because we keep forgetting how old the idea may be. The Mesopotamian scribes did not forget. They copied and recopied and recopied for centuries, then for millennia. They preserved the cases, preserved the precedents, preserved the rhythms of lawful power. They did not preserve the name of the architect, only the architecture. So the question returns as it has returned all along, because the tablets themselves return to it without naming it directly. What were the Sumerians trying to preserve? Not merely the names of gods. Names alone do not require so much procedural detail, not merely stories of wonder. Wonder alone does not require assembly protocol, office, transfer, public presentation, jurisdictional distinction, voting sequence, or the repeated insistence that a power belongs to a position rather than a person. They seem to have been preserving a pattern, a structure, a warning perhaps, or an education, a way of seeing authority. Again and again, the archive circles the same core realities. Power exists, but it is constrained. Authority can be effective without being legitimate. Legitimate authority requires procedure. Offices outlast their holders. Realms have boundaries. Creation has rules. Rebellion has types. Consequence follows violation. Oaths bind. The system can be stressed, but it tends toward restoration. And each time the same shadow appears behind those realities, the framework itself remains older and larger than the beings administering it. The Anunnaki are not presented as omnipotent creators standing outside order. They are presented as high-ranking participants inside order. They can transfer authority, but not invent authority from nothing. They can decree within certain channels, but not abolish the channels. They can govern their domains intensely, but cannot simply erase another realm's law. They can make policy, but not escape consequence. They can revise parameters, but not rewrite the existence of parameter itself. To put it another way, the cosmos of these tablets is not governed by personality alone. It is governed by structure. That is why the distinction between legitimate and illegitimate power matters so much. Anzu can possess the tablet and still not be rightful. Ninurta can recover the tablet and still not claim permanent sovereignty. Inanna can secure the Emmy through completed form and thereby keep them despite Enki's regret. The flood can be lawfully authorized and still prove disastrously unwise. A king can sit on the throne and still fail the office. The text keeps separating title, possession, function, and legitimacy into different but interacting elements. That is sophisticated thought, slow thought, administrative thought, and perhaps that is why they survive on clay lists, clay case studies, clay epics that so often behave like annotated precedents. They are not intoxicated by charisma. They are interested in mechanism. What happens when a ruler overreaches? What happens when an office token is stolen? What happens when labor becomes unsustainable? What happens when one jurisdiction is crossed by another? What happens when a formal transfer is completed, even under dubious circumstances? What happens when a policy succeeds procedurally and fails practically? What happens when a god dissents without breaking the oath? The archive answers these questions not with sweeping doctrine, but with scenarios. Examples. Narratives that feel in this light almost like training material. Not because they are dry, but because they preserve the function of the system under pressure. And perhaps that is what later readers so often miss when they hurry to classify. If you decide in advance that the texts are merely myths, then you stop listening to the procedural density. If you decide in advance that they must be secret histories of one dramatic modern theory or another, you also stop listening. In either case, the clay is forced to say what we already wanted it to say. But the tablets themselves are quieter, more disciplined. They say less, and because they say less, they may imply more. They do not say the Anunnaki created the cosmos. They say the Anunnaki administered it. They do not say authority is natural to divinity. They say authority is mediated by office, object, and law. They do not say the strongest always rule. They say right, transfer matters. They do not say law is whatever gods decide. They say even gods must work through law. They do not say the framework began with the gods. They leave the framework's source unstated. That last silence remains the deepest one. The me are there. The tablet is there. The boundaries are there. The assemblies already know how to function. The procedures already have force. The code, if we may call it that, is already running. If there was ever an origin account for the architecture itself, it is not central in what survives. What survives is use, administration, crisis, restoration, human participation through kingship and ritual. The archive begins again and again in the middle of the system already operating. And maybe that is the point. Maybe the scribes did not know the beginning, or knew it was inaccessible, and therefore preserved what could be known the interface. The lawful behaviors, the thresholds, the consequences, the shape of power as it appears from within. That would make the archive simultaneously modest and enormous. Modest because it never pretends to final explanation. Enormous because it preserves with remarkable fidelity a model of reality in which governance extends beyond the human realm and remains accountable to rules deeper than any current governor. That model is unsettling because it cuts two ways at once. It humbles human power, obviously. Kings are temporary operators, not sources, but it also humbles divine power. Gods themselves become office holders in a larger order. And once both human and divine power are humbled in that way, something else rises into view: law, not as human convention only, and not as divine whim, but as the very architecture of relation, jurisdiction, and consequence. If that sounds abstract, the tablets make it concrete. A stolen tablet, a refused labor burden, a descent through 7 gates, a flood vote, a kingship transferred from city to city, a dead goddess hanging on a hook until lawful substitution is arranged, a king losing legitimacy before he loses his city, a god unable to create humanity without assembly clay, blood, and proper speech. This is law made narrative, or narrative used to preserve law. And that is why the same question asked from different angles still does not dissolve. If there were governors who made the government, if there were offices who established the offices, if there were jurisdictions who drew the boundaries, if there were me who first encoded them into reality, if there were laws, gods could not break what stood above the gods. The tablets do not answer, but they refuse to let the question disappear. And so we arrive not at a solution, but at the edge of one more return. The vault is still quiet. The clay is still cool. The wedge marks are still there, pressed by hands long gone, yet carrying forward a pattern of thought that remains oddly alive. Across 4,000 years, the tablets continue to insist on the same difficult possibility that reality, even at its highest levels, may be governed less by personality than by law. Not law in the narrow modern sense of statutes and courts alone. Law, in the deeper sense, the Mesopotamian archive keeps circling structured permission, bounded office, procedural legitimacy, territorial competence, consequence that follows from design rather than mood. Law as architecture. If that is what the scribes were preserving, then they were not primarily trying to tell us that gods once walked the earth in the sensational way later speculation prefers. Nor were they mainly trying to flatter kings with divine ancestry. Nor were they simply inventing entertaining tales to pass through the dark. They were preserving evidence that power, even divine power, was not ultimate. That is the thread that runs through everything, through Anzu's theft, through Inanna's transfer of the Emi, through the labor revolt of the Igigi, through the assembly that creates humanity, through the flood decision and Enki's procedural descent, through kingship descending from heaven, through Gilgamesh learning that mortality is not his to negotiate, through the underworld, judges before whom rank offers no exemption. The same truth keeps returning because the texts keep returning to it. Power exists, great power, terrible power, civilizational power, cosmic power. But power is not the same thing as sovereignty, and sovereignty in these tablets seems to belong finally not to any single god, but to the lawful order they all inhabit. That does not solve the origin question. It intensifies it. Because once we accept the possibility that the Anunnaki were administrators rather than originators, we are forced to look past them, past the assembly, past the local patron gods, past the human kings who served beneath them. We are forced to look toward the unnamed source from which the structure itself arose. The archive gives us no easy answer. Perhaps none was available to the scribes. Perhaps the origin had already receded beyond memory when the earliest lists were compiled. Perhaps the design specifications were never in human hands. Or perhaps the question itself belonged to a level of reality accessible only through effects, not through direct inspection. That last possibility is part of what makes the tablets feel so modern and so ancient at once. We too often live inside systems we did not design. We know their procedures better than their origins. We understand the interface before the foundation. We learn how authority moves, how permissions are granted, how consequences propagate, without always knowing who wrote the deepest rules. The Mesopotamian scribes may have been preserving something similar on a cosmic scale. And if so, then their greatest act of intellectual discipline was restraint. They did not fill the silence with invention. They did not always pretend to know more than they knew. They copied what they had: transfers, decrees, cases, outcomes, offices, jurisdictions, assembly acts, divine constraints. They preserved the workings of the system and left its first cause largely unwritten. That silence is not emptiness. It is evidence of a limit. It tells us where their knowledge stopped. And because it tells us that, it also tells us how seriously they took what remained on the page. 3,000 years of copying, 3,000 years of preserving the same structures across Sumerian, Akkadian, Babylonian, and Assyrian hands. 3,000 years of insisting in one narrative after another that there are rules beneath power and powers beneath rules, and that neither the king nor the god stands alone at the top. What were they trying to tell us? Perhaps only this: that legitimacy matters more than force. That offices are larger than office holders. That authority detached from lawful transfer destabilizes the world. That boundaries are real. That creation has limits. That administration without wisdom can become catastrophe. That dissent within law may preserve what raw obedience would destroy. That the universe may be structured more carefully than it first appears. And perhaps one more thing: that the deepest order is often least visible. The Emmy are not seen directly as modern people want to see things. The tablet of destinies appears only in fragments and echoes. Jurisdiction reveals itself through consequence. Legitimate office reveals itself when illegitimate seizure fails to endure. The architecture becomes visible not because it steps forward and names itself, but because events keep striking against it and being shaped by it. That is how hidden structure often appears: through resistance, through constraint, through the pattern of what cannot be done even by the mighty. So if you lie there now in darkness, somewhere between waking thought and sleep, the oldest question in this archive may still be hanging in the air. Not whether the Anunnaki were aliens, not whether the stories are literally modern history in disguise, but something quieter, more difficult, more enduring. What kind of cosmos is this, if even gods must follow rules? And what does it mean that the oldest urban civilization we know preserved that possibility with such calm precision? Not panic, not spectacle, just clay, lists, stories that read like case law, minutes of assemblies, records of transfers, notes on crisis and restoration. The scribes wrote by lamplight, we read by screenlight. Between those two lights, the question has not disappeared. Who designed a reality in which authority is delegated, bounded, and reviewed? Who built a world that can be governed, but not finally tyrannized? Who placed checks and balances so deep in the structure that even divine beings become administrators rather than masters? The tablets do not say, They leave us with evidence rather than conclusion, with procedure rather than revelation, with the shape of a system still operating, whether as a theology, memory, metaphor, record, or something that slips between those words. And perhaps that is why they endure, because answers close. But good evidence remains open. If this is something you want me to continue refining, I can turn these 12 parts into a more cinematic voiceover draft with tighter sentence music while keeping the same duration and contemplative pacing.